Hey, everybody. Welcome to a special edition of the speaker series meetings. And my name is Ray. I'm a recovering sex and porn addict. And our speaker today is going to be Dr. Anna Lembke from the Stanford School of Medicine. Let me just give a brief introduction for her. She's a professor of psychiatry at Stanford. She's also a practicing clinical psychiatrist. She's the medical director of addiction medicine at the Stanford Medical School, program director of the Stanford Addiction Medicine Fellowship, and chief of the Stanford Addiction Medicine Dual Diagnosis Center, among other things. Dr. Lembke, welcome. Welcome back. And how do you want to get started now? How would you like to do this?
Well, I'm really open to whatever works for all of you, but I think what we had talked about was I would just go through the questions in the chat. How does that sound?
Yeah, that sounds great.
All right, great. Let's see. So the first one is, what is the level of dopamine from internet porn equivalent to? The answer is nobody really knows. We are not yet very good at measuring absolute dopamine levels in the brain or even relative dopamine levels in humans. What we can do is rough guesstimations based on normal subjects. We do have the ability to put a probe into a rat's brain and see how the rat responds to different types of rewards. And Ray, if I could share my slides.
Sure, I'm the key co-host here.
Okay, great. I'm just going to quickly show you some of that rat literature. And so basically what we're doing at this point is we're inferring about pornography and sex addiction based on what we know about drug addiction. We don't yet have good data on sex and pornography, except that we know for sure that it stimulates the reward circuit in the human brain, and that means that it's releasing dopamine in the human brain. That we know, but the sort of relative amounts we don't know yet. So I'm going to just share my screen with you. I'm not going to put it in slideshow mode. I'm just going to show you this. Can you all see this image here? So this is an image that's a compilation of many studies over many years in mice and rats, looking at how much dopamine is released in response to certain rewards. Now, keep in mind that we're always releasing a tonic baseline level of dopamine in our brain reward pathway. That's just like baseline breathing. It's the breathing amount of dopamine that we have, like a heartbeat. And then when we do something or ingest something, if it's reinforcing for us, it will increase dopamine release in that specific circuit called the reward pathway. And how much it releases and how fast it releases in our unique brains speaks to its addictive potential. And what you can see here is that in a rat, sex increases dopamine firing 100% above baseline, a little bit more than chocolate, less than nicotine. What these studies in rats don't account for is drug of choice, which is to say that there are inter-individual differences. What might release 100% above baseline in your brain might only be 50% above baseline in my brain. So very important to keep that in mind. And just broadly speaking, this is the reward circuit. It consists of these phylogenetically conserved very old nuclei, the nucleus accumbens in the ventral tegmental area. This is where dopamine is specifically released from specific dopamine releasing neurons. But there's this interesting communication with the prefrontal cortex, which is this gray matter area of our brains right behind our foreheads, which is so important for storytelling, delayed gratification, and appreciating future consequences. So one way to think about this reward circuit is to think about it like a car. The prefrontal cortex is the brakes, the nucleus accumbens and ventral tegmental area is the accelerator. If we have a problem with the brakes or a problem with the accelerator or both, then we are prone to addiction. So I hope that was helpful. Let's see. Are there medications available to help with the addictive obsessive factor? I am an alcoholic addict in recovery. Is there a direct correlation between these addictions and sex addiction? Okay, so let me answer the second part first. There is a direct correlation between having an addiction to anything and then getting addicted to something else. And we know this from human experience, and we also know this from animal studies. And the correlation is as follows. Once you've developed an addiction to anything, a serious addiction, you are more vulnerable to an addiction to something else. And that is called cross addiction. And we think that that vulnerability is distinct and independent from the innate vulnerability you may have to addiction that you were born with, because we know that that's true too, right? That some people are born more vulnerable to addiction than others. And that may be a problem with the accelerator or a problem with the brakes. I'm going to tell you briefly just about a couple of studies showing this. First of all, in animals, if you take an animal and you get it addicted to methamphetamine, and then you remove that, and by the way, what that means in an animal model is given open access to methamphetamine or another drug, that animal will press that lever until exhaustion or until it dies. That's the addiction model in animals. So if you get a rat addicted to methamphetamine through a lever press, and then you take that methamphetamine away for a year, which is about a rat lifetime, and then you expose that animal to a lever press for something like cannabis, what you will find is that animal will get addicted to cannabis faster than an animal who had never been exposed to methamphetamine. So there is this sense that it is the drug exposure that changes the brain. Another very important experiment along these lines was an experiment where methamphetamine, why methamphetamine so often in rats? Because they get addicted to it really easily. So often that's the model. Whereas interestingly, it's really hard to get rats addicted to alcohol. You have to engineer a kind of a subspecies of rats to get them to lever press to exhaustion for alcohol. So anyway, if you take a rat and you inject methamphetamine or cocaine into that rat, what you will see is the rat, instead of hiding out in the shadows of the cage, it will start to jog a little bit across the center of the cage. With each day, you give it another injection of the same amount. So you're not increasing the amount, you're giving the same amount of methamphetamine every day. And each day, that rat starts to run faster and faster until by day 7, the rat is in this kind of running frenzy. So what's interesting about that is that it suggests there's some kind of potentiation with repeated exposure to the same amount of the same drug causing this locomotive behavior. But then here's the really interesting piece. If you then do not give that rat any methamphetamine or any drug for a year, again, a rat lifetime, and then you re-inject that animal with methamphetamine, it will instantly be in a running frenzy, identical to day 7 of the serial injections. So what that tells us is that there's some kind of latent scar or latent change in the rat brain such that a single exposure to their drug, even after a sustained period of abstinence, plummets them deep into their addiction. And of course, that is very consistent with what we see in humans, right? People even in long-term recovery, slips happen, relapse is part of addiction. We can pick ourselves back up again, but it's not uncommon with a single exposure in relapse to find ourselves on a serious binge, kind of immersed again into that addiction loop. After I talk about these experiments, I always like to say, don't lose hope. Just because there are changes in the brain, it doesn't mean recovery isn't possible. My colleague Edie Sullivan has done amazing work looking at what happens in the brain as people get into recovery. And it looks like what happens is that the brain develops new circuits that reroute around those damaged areas. So recovery is real, recovery is robust and sustained and positive, and you can get into recovery and stay into recovery for a lifetime. So that's the second part about that. So the first part, are there medications available? There are no FDA approved medications for sex addiction. And when I say sex addiction, I'm using like all of the broad sweeping forms in which that comes, whether it's actually having sex or masturbating and looking at images or in some other way leading to orgasm. That's like the big bucket here. so there are no FDA approved medicines, but what we use off-label, and off-label means we're using a medicine not for which it was FDA approved, or even necessarily for which there are a lot of studies, but which we have found to be effective. We use SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, for sex addiction. The reason we use SSRIs like Prozac, Paxil, Zoloft, Celexa is twofold. The first reason is that it can be helpful for the anxiety and dysphoria, especially in early recovery when we give up our drug of choice and we plummet into that dopamine deficit state characterized by depression and anxiety. So it can be helpful for that. But number two, the side effect for many people of serotonin modulators is to decrease libido and make it more difficult to get an orgasm. So these are sort of simple, what I call self-binding strategies, ways that we can just put barriers between ourselves and our drug of choice to make it harder. One thing that's been, and I'm going to share a little bit about me because I do in the book, and I always do it, try to do it thoughtfully so that it can be helpful to others. But it's been interesting for me as somebody, with, what I would consider to be a sex addiction to romance novels, how much easier my recovery has been since I've gone through menopause. And so my natural libido with aging has really plummeted. Just speaking to the chemical piece of it and how hard it is when you have libido, how hard it is to manage the addiction, but still very, very possible. And I think really what it comes down to is, abstinence, letting the brain heal, but also then transferring that libidinous energy to other healthier, more adaptive things, primarily healthy relationships. And also I think creative pursuits are really important, like relational creative pursuits. I think of people with sex addiction as people who are really attracted to people, like they're people, and they're not thing people, they're people. And yet it's a kind of a thwarted desire for people that leads to the sex addiction. In terms of like a direct correlation between alcohol and sex, I don't think there's anything specific there. When I think about like so there's this whole self-medication hypothesis, which was came up with in the early 1900s by a guy named Sander Rado, who was an acolyte of Freud's. He was one of Freud's students. And he asked the question that people had been asking for hundreds of years: why is it that some people can use drugs in moderation and others cannot? And his hypothesis was that, people with addiction are self-medicating an underlying mental illness. And if we could just treat the mental illness, these people wouldn't be addicted. The form that this has taken in our era is, people are self-medicating an underlying trauma. If only we could, process that underlying trauma, people wouldn't be addicted. There is some truth to those narratives, but I think they've become overblown. And what they ignore is that addiction itself is a primary progressive disease with its own neurobiological basis and innate vulnerability. Those other things can tip the scale and make somebody more likely, but addiction is its own disease. Addictive things are inherently addictive, and most people who are exposed to them will find them reinforcing. The question is, will they find them so reinforcing that their brain goes, whoop, I need to do that again and again and again. And for different people, it's going to be a different drug. So like when I think about correlations between specific addictions, there is evidence for like opioid addiction and alcohol addiction. Why? Because alcohol actually works primarily on our endogenous opioid system, which ultimately then leads to the cascade, which releases dopamine, which is the final common pathway for all reinforcing drugs and behaviors. I think you could kind of make an argument maybe that sex addiction primarily is mediated by serotonin, a vulnerability to serotonin being our affiliative or bonding neurotransmitter. But, we can't really oversimplify these things. It's a big mix of a lot of stuff, and we're just barely grasping it. Is there a form, so this is the next question. Is there a form of healthy masturbation for those of us who are porn addicts? Great question. And I think my answer to this is it depends on the person. I think that some people may be able to engage in that kind of, behavior and keep it, let's say, manageable, just like some people who have been addicted to alcohol. There are new studies, and also I've seen this in my career, in a very rare and small sliver of people who can go back to drinking alcohol in moderation after a period of sustained abstinence. But here's what I see in my practice: it's ultimately not worth it. Even if they can do it, it is so exhausting to keep it manageable or moderated that it's not worth it. Abstinence is easier, but it's hard, especially, when, I don't remember who said it, but somebody in this group said it was so good. With it, what do you do when the bar is in your head? It might've been Johnny. When the bar is in your head, you don't even have to go to the bar is in your head, that fantasy life. So that's hard. You have to really reroute and start to tell different consoling stories, and for me, and I'm guessing many people on this call, the addiction almost starts with the realm of fantasy, right? The way that we soothed ourselves, even as very, very young children, with some kind of romantic or sexual fantasy. Hi, Anna, thank you for your work. You're welcome, Ethan. Why does the brain of an addict remain hyperreactive to cues, triggers for sex and porn? Why do these cues for sex and porn trigger intense craving and motivation even after the withdrawal period is over, even after a level of dopamine balance has seemingly been restored? Okay, great question. And this gets to the ways in which our brain is permanently changed after we have become addicted. And I use this metaphor of the pleasure-pain balance and these gremlins that hop on the pain side of the balance in order to bring us back into homeostasis. And the way that they tip us to the pain side, I don't know that I need to explain that here. Let me know if I do. I'm happy to go through it again, but it's in my book, and I think I've done it on this call before. But the bottom line is, once those neuroadaptation gremlins get created, they never entirely go away. And they love it on the balance, so they're waiting on the wings to hop on again, which means that cues for our drug of choice are not, what's the word? They're not neutral stimuli. They actually make us a little bit high and put us into a little bit of withdrawal. And I'm going to share screen again just to show you how that looks. Okay, so if you can see this is a rat that's been trained to know that when it sees a light, if it then goes over and presses this button, it will receive an injection of cocaine, okay? And these are, and the y-axis is dopamine levels in the rat's reward pathway, and the x-axis is a timeline. So you can see this rat has a baseline level of dopamine firing even before engaging with its reward. Then it sees a light, and that light, it knows, tells it that, oh, if I now do the work to go get my drug, I'm gonna get my drug and I'm gonna feel really, really good. But look at what happens to dopamine when the rat sees the light. Dopamine levels increase just with the light, just with the trigger, even without the reward. But here's the key piece. After this little increase in dopamine levels don't go back down to baseline. They go below baseline. So now we're in a dopamine deficit state, and that is craving. And that craving is what drives us to want to do the work to get the drug, to even just get back to normal baseline levels of dopamine firing. And we've evolved over millions of years of evolution to do that, right? So this is a very primitive physiologic drive, which once triggered is difficult to resist, because it's the drive to homeostasis, or baseline levels, which really dominates all living organisms. So what that means for us is, not only do we have to, and then of course, once the rat presses cocaine, you see a huge increase in levels of cocaine in the reward pathway. What this tells us is that to be in healthy recovery, not only do we need to get rid of the cocaine, we need to get rid of the light, right? We need to not be seeing that. The other thing is, every time we deviate from neutrality, every time we increase dopamine firing, we also release adrenaline and release cortisol. This is literal stress for us to be engaging in this constant cycle. Okay. How does S.P.A.A. relate to CPTSD? So how does sex, I'm interpreting this to mean, how does sex addiction relate to chronic PTSD? Did I get that right? Okay. Stress.
That's correct.
That's correct. Okay, great. So stress and trauma is a risk factor for addiction. It's very clear that people who have had serious trauma in their lives, especially during childhood, are at increased risk for all kinds of mental health disorders, including addiction. How exactly that works, we don't know. It probably works on an epigenetic level. What do we mean by epigenetics? We mean that when you're born, you have a set of base pairs that make up your DNA. But which proteins are expressed by your DNA depends on your experiences. And if you have certain types of traumatic experiences, that can turn on certain proteins and turn off others. So we really are a compilation, not just of the DNA expression that we were born with, but also our experiences. So that means that chronic PTSD relates to sex addiction in a number of different ways. Number one, it can predispose us to developing sex addiction. And here I think, especially if you're dealing with the trauma of attachment disorders, because again, I think that people who are addicted to sex are people. They're attachment people. They have a deep need for intimacy and attachment to others. Not everybody does. You know, people who are kind of Asperger-y or on the autism spectrum may not really have that same deep need, or some people can have lots of friends but don't need that deep intimacy need. But I think people with sex addiction, behind it, it's a deep need for intimacy, which is temperamental and inborn. And then if you have some kind of unhealthy attachment, an unreliable, unsteady, or manipulative caregiver early in life, that's going to then set you up to use your drug in the form of sex and an orgasm as a replacement for the lack of the kind of healthy bonding in your real life. Also, once in recovery, it's very clear that if we're exposed to a significant stressor, our reflexive response to that stressor is to go seek out our drug. There's a very famous rat experiment showing that if you get a rat addicted to really any drug, and then you take the drug away, and then the rat is, long period without the drug, and then you expose that rat to a very painful foot shock, the first thing, I forgot to explain something. Sorry. So what happens when you have trained a rat to be addictive, such that when they press a lever or a button, they get an injection cocaine, and then you take the cocaine away, initially the rat will still continue to press the lever because they're wanting their drug. But then eventually they'll realize that there's no drug coming and they'll stop pressing the lever. And in neuroscience, we call that extinguishing the behavior. So you've extinguished the behavior, and then the rat stops going to the lever because it realizes, I'm not going to get drugged there. It stops going. But then if you expose the rat to a very painful foot shock, the first thing that rat will do is run to the lever that it hasn't touched for months, and it will start pressing that lever. So again, some kind of latent, primitive encoding that has us reflexively turning to our drug in times of stress, which is why it's so important to build these self-binding strategies, these barriers between ourselves and our drug of choice, so that when we are experiencing stressors, we have to climb mountains to get our drug. And hopefully in the process of climbing those mountains, we will realize, oh, wait, I don't want to do this. Our prefrontal cortex will kick in and put on the brakes. Okay.
Thanks, Anna.
Yeah, you're welcome. Does a porn addiction lead to permanent cognitive impairment? Any chance this can be reversed? So as I've been talking about, it does lead to permanent brain changes, but not necessarily cognitive impairment. Our brains are like a map of our lived experience, and it's always there latently. And in some ways, that's great because we can remember stuff that happened to us a long time ago that we need, and that makes us happy. But the bad part is that it's hippocampal tattoos for a lifetime, even of things that we don't want, especially things that have a lot of emotional valence. So if you think about your earliest childhood memories, it's either a really positive thing or a really negative thing, or both. So it's those highly emotional experiences that get the deepest memory encoding. But I wouldn't say it's cognitive impairment. I would just say it's cognitive changes. I know I am a porn addict, but sometimes wonder, am I really a sex addict? How do I know for sure? So that's an interesting question that I'm not sure I really understand. To me, sex addiction encompasses all of the behaviors that we do that ultimately lead to orgasm or to escaping into the fantasy life, hoping for orgasm or anticipating orgasm or akin to orgasm. So to me, it's all sort of the same. I think it's probably a combination of circumstances and temperament that determine whether or not it's just pornography or you're actually going and hooking up with people. People who are maybe shyer might be less prone to go and actually hook up. People who are more gregarious, it might have to do with attractiveness. People who can easily get partners might end up getting more partners. All those, it might have to do with money, right? People who have money and who can pay for certain types of rewards. So I think these are the same diseases. They're just a slightly different phenotype. But I'm open to any of your thoughts on that. Really, I'm open to your thoughts on any of what I've said, but that's kind of how I'm thinking of it. Ray, did you have any comments or thoughts?
Yeah.
What's that?
Not yet. I don't have any comments or thoughts.
Okay, Ray's shy.
Set's got one. Set's got one.
Hey, thank you for this opportunity, Dr. Lembke, sex and porn addict. I 100% agree with you. I don't think there's like I've always been like, hey, if you're a porn addict, then you're a sex addict, because there's no way to be addicted to porn and not have that be sex. You're having sex with yourself. I've yet to encounter someone who just looks at porn and never masturbates to it and never orgasms because of it. It always has that same sexual payoff. I think maybe some people are like, because we have some single members who are like, okay, I'm addicted to porn, but can I not be like involved in hookup culture? Like maybe I can control and enjoy hookup culture, even though I can't control and enjoy porn. And so that's some area where some people want to make a distinction between I'm addicted to porn, but I may not be addicted to sex. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I do have thoughts. So my first thought is, I consider my romance novel reading addiction a porn addiction. I consider romance novels and erotica socially sanctioned pornography for women. And I think it's the exact same process. It's the same phenomenology. It's the same natural history. So I think I would just want to echo what I said before and also agree with you, Seth, that it's the same. It's not the behavior itself. It's the quantity and frequency of the behavior, the impact of the behavior on our lives, and the nature of our attachment to that behavior, how we are turning to it for some self-soothing or a maladaptive coping, how we get caught up in it. It's honestly hard for me to imagine that you could, be in recovery from a pornography addiction and engage in the hookup culture in a healthy way, because I don't think hookup culture is healthy. It's basically, a mercantile exchange for sexual encounters in the absence largely of having a relationship. So I just don't know how that could be, that you could hook up and have it not be part of your sex addiction. But I understand that for many people, that sounds very moralistic. And so, my ideas about that, I appreciate that there's difference of opinion. All right, I'm going to keep going.
Questions, Anna? Yes, thank you.
Oh, yeah. Okay, let's see. Coming from a line of family of addicts, what measures can I take to prevent from passing my genetic predispositions towards addiction to my future kin? Oh, this is a great question, because it encompasses the desire to be a good parent, the fears that we have as parents, but also the very complex nature of codependency and how we can be in relation to our family members and yet not try to control what we can't control. So it is true, we know from scientific research that if you have a biological parent or grandparent with an alcohol addiction, then you are at increased risk to develop an alcohol addiction, even if raised outside of that alcoholic home. So we can infer from that, although we don't have the studies yet, that if you are addicted to sex, your child may be at increased risk for a sex addiction. And I think the best way to handle that is to talk openly and transparently about your recovery. So importantly, you know, to be open about what addiction is, how it affects the brain, how you've struggled with it. For example, all my kids know about my problems, right? And we have to be careful that we're not just like using our kids as therapists or something like that in a gratuitous, self-serving way, always the self-reflection and the mindfulness. But I think really talking openly about addiction. Alcoholism runs in my family. My father was an alcoholic. My uncle died of his disease. My husband's sister died of opioid addiction and alcohol. So, you know, we've got it on both strains. Our kids are very, very aware. And we talk about it all the time. And I have, of my children, I have one son who's in college now, who is just teetering on the border of both a sex addiction and an alcohol addiction. And of course, I'm very worried about him. But all I can do is just arm him with the knowledge, be in loving relation to him, and practice my serenity prayer around what I can't control. The relation between borderline personality disorder and addiction. Can S.P.A.A. be considered as an alternative for behavioral therapy? Thanks, Dr. Anna. So this is interesting. Borderline personality disorder, a really pernicious and toxic personality state characterized by chronic maladaptive interpersonal style that hurts ourselves and hurts other people. One of the hardest things about living or being in relation to somebody who has borderline personality disorders, they're often very smart and very insightful and very emotionally attuned, so that at times they can appear actually wise. And so then we keep trying, we can even get addicted to that, trying to recapture the wise aspect of our personality disordered loved one. It's a very toxic kind of addictive cycle. The other thing I want to say is that when people are in their addiction, they all look personality disordered. One of the really interesting discoveries for me as I began treating addiction 20 years ago was to find that patients who I was convinced had a borderline personality disorder, once they got into recovery, no longer looked that way. So I think that's important to keep in mind, that we don't want to make that diagnosis too lightly, and especially when people are in recovery from addiction, all of the stigmata of that kind of personality disorder may go away. So the answer to that is then I do think that 12-step recovery is a great way to help people with personality disorder, borderline personality disorder traits, or the disorder, just because it's a moral way of living in relation to other people with specific actionable guidelines, which much of different types of psychotherapy doesn't give you. And then also, I think 12 steps is very useful if you happen to be in relation or live with someone with borderline personality disorder, because 12-step explores this whole codependency thing and the ways in which we can get addicted to other people and continue our addictive maladaptive behavior in relationship. Here's Jason. I realize I'm never going to get through all these messages, so either I need to speed up or something. I'll do my best here. These are such great questions.
Come back for part 2.
Yeah, okay, there you go. What are the benefits and drawbacks of drying out when you're in a committed relationship? Are there other behaviors you shouldn't do when you're drying out, snuggling, kissing? Should the partners remain clothed in front of each other? Most importantly, how do we maintain a physical mental? Oh, this is the million-dollar question. So what I don't know exactly what the answer is. I can tell you what I recommend to my patients in early recovery is no orgasms with themselves or others. So, you know, a period of absence I think is important to reset reward pathways. And then being very intentional about what you, for you and your life, think of as healthy sexual behavior and what isn't. And then trying to avoid what isn't, including the triggers that might lead you down that path, as well as, you know, letting yourself enjoy and engage in healthy sexual behavior. So I guess I wouldn't want to determine for you whether snuggling and kissing is okay with or without clothes. You know, I had a patient who for a long time had to wear clothes while shaving, because even seeing his own body was a trigger for relapse for him, because his body had become, you know, his plaything. For me, interestingly, I found that a big trigger was listening to certain types of music. So there's a lot of romantic love music on the radio, and that became something that I didn't listen to anymore, because that was just a trigger for me to want to use. So you got to kind of figure it out for yourself. Brian S. says,
Can I interject something here?
yeah,
Can I just
please.
interject something? Let's leave the chat box for questions for Anna and not for comments. Please, thank you.
Okay. And then how do you maintain, I'm sorry, one last thing, how do you maintain a physical or mental level of image during this period? I guess I do feel strongly that not fantasizing while you're with your partner is important and really, really hard. But I think, you know, eyes wide open and being present. And I think what happens then is that it's just a really different experience. And I think that's one thing we have to openly acknowledge and accept, that sex, loving sex with a partner, it just feels different. It's almost like a totally different activity. And if we keep expecting it to be the same as when we're masturbating or when we're having sex with, you know, in our addiction, we're just going to be frustrated. We have to, it's just different. You're present, you're sensitive to them, they're sensitive to you. In some ways, it's scary. It's just not the same kind of, you're just not getting high in the same kind of way. And just kind of grieving that loss and accepting it and walking that road. Besides cold showers and exercise, can you recommend any other ways to tip the pain balance to give us some sustained dopamine? What else can we do when we recognize we are in a state of deficit? Yeah, so I like this whole hormesis idea, doing things that are hard as a way to reset reward pathways. Intermittent fasting is one of them. Exercise is one of them. As you mentioned, ice cold showers is one. I like to do cognitive and emotional challenges too. One of them is to try to go through a whole day without telling a single lie. This is very hard. The average adult tells 1 to 2 lies per day. Mostly these lies are small lies we tell ourselves and others about how we're cooler than we actually are, or we're more interesting than we actually are. So one thing that I notice that I do, mostly because I have teenage kids who will not let you get away with anything, is that when I tell a story, I exaggerate it. And it might be like a small thing, like I might say, oh, and I was waiting for 20 minutes, when in reality, I was waiting for 8 minutes. But 8 minutes doesn't seem interesting enough to me, so I make it 20 minutes. And for me, that makes the story more interesting. And that's just not a true story. So if I'm pretending it's the truth, I have to stick to the facts. And doing that is hard. So that's another thing that we can do, is like, just really like challenge ourselves with these experiments. I also think martial arts is great. Also prayer and meditation. Who wants to sit in a room quietly and, you know, focus on their breathing? That's not, you know, that's hard, but it's good for you. So those are all the things. Does having sex with a partner in a committed relationship slow down the withdrawal healing process? Ooh, that is good. And I'm not sure, but my guess is that it is actually the opposite, and that it can help you because it's the right kind of sex. It's sacred sex where you're deepening intimacy. And we know that when we make deep human connections with people, we release oxytocin, our love hormone, which binds to receptors in the reward pathway and releases dopamine. So it's a different kind of expansive or spiritual dopamine that I think can speed up the healing process. Jeff says, can you suggest any technique for addicts who also suffer from chronic PTSD and cannot seem to sleep? Well, sleeping is always a hard one. I mean, you know, many of us use our drug to sleep. I know I did that for years. And so I get a mounting anxiety when it gets close to bedtime. And then I sort of lie there wide awake, even though I'm really tired. So sleeping is a tough one. There are all kinds of sleep hygiene things. As I always say to my patients, the most important thing the best pill I can give you for sleep is morning exercise, so that you build up enough sleep debt during the day so that you're tired at the end of the day. So you want to avoid the bed, you want to avoid naps, you want to be exhausted, so that even though as you're lying in bed, you may have a compulsion to do your drug, if you don't do it, you will find that you fall asleep surprisingly quickly. In terms of, you know, mid-cycle awakening, what I recommend is to just not get anxious about it. You know, there is this a whole branch of science of sleep, which actually argues that we are not meant to sleep through the night and then wake up refreshed the next day. We think of that as normal, healthy sleep, but in fact, we're wired for mid-cycle awakenings, to wake in the middle of the night and to be somewhat hypervigilant. There's a whole theory around this that has to do with safety and checking your territory in the middle of the night. and then going back to sleep for the second installment. I know as I'm aging, that's more typical than not, that I will wake for a period of time in the night and then go back to sleep. So for folks out there who are more on my side of the age spectrum, I know you can relate. But the key there is not to get anxious about not sleeping. And even if you have a night where you're not sleeping at all, just try to rest your body, try to rest your mind. Maybe there's some creative pursuit that you're trying to solve, a problem that you're trying to solve. In many ways, I think people with severe addiction are problem solvers. They like to have a knot that they're unraveling. And of course, getting your drug and hiding your drug is a very creative pursuit, but not a good one. So what you need is a replacement creative thing. And for me, that's been writing the books has been helpful. Thinking about last night, I got a great deal of joy out of thinking about the fact that we had cleaned out our attic and how good it looks now with all the junk out of it. So, problem solving, find a problem, try to solve it. How can trauma, yeah.
Could we, I'm just asking, could we scroll down and find some questions from the EU retreat? They had some questions in there too. And I think this was part of the EU retreat schedule anyway.
Okay, I will. EU retreat group. How can the roles of spiritual principles like forgiveness in the 8th and 9th step work in conjunction with trauma, recovery, and grief without performing a spiritual bypass? Ooh, that's very good. Okay, so, I think this kind of forgiveness for others and forgiveness of ourselves is key in order to get past the shame. Shame is this interesting double-edged sword. If we didn't feel shame about our behaviors, we wouldn't be motivated to change them. So we need to allow ourselves to feel the shame. On the other hand, if we get mired in our shame, we will not be able to move forward, and that will just drive our continued compulsive use. So spiritual principles like forgiveness and empathy for ourselves and others are really, really important for letting go of resentments. And of course, we do know that resentments are a heavy burden to carry, and can also drive this narrative of victimhood, which is central to addiction. One of the most interesting things that I've seen in over 20 years of seeing patients with addiction is that the way people tell their stories predicts whether or not they're going to get into recovery. And when I have people who come in and tell their story about how he did this to me and she did that to me, I know those people are very far away from recovery. But when they can come in and say, he did that to me and she did this to me, and here's what I'm doing that is perpetuating this problem, then I know that we're on the good path. So I hope that's helpful. I hope that answers that question. In terms of spiritual bypass, I mean, this is sort of, the Serenity Prayer, gosh, what a simple cone, and yet so powerful, right? The courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Let's just talk about the courage to change the things I can. That requires an enormous amount of reflection around what it is that I can actually do and what it is that I cannot do. And then deciding that I can do something, being willing to take that step. And we don't have to talk about, solving global warming. We can just talk about apologizing to somebody that we know we wronged, and how hard that is. I mean, I have had to stew on that for days and weeks before I can muster up the courage to go and do what I know is right, which is apologize to that person. But it is amazing and very spiritual, the things that happen, both immediately and at a distance. These are sort of forces at a distance, kind of like gravity. When we do the things that we can and we take that courageous step. I had a patient who said something that I thought was so wise regarding this. He said, you know what I've learned in recovery? He said, the hard way is usually the right way. And I hold that really close to me, because I think that's true. It's the hard thing, the thing that we want to do least. That's probably the thing that we need to do. On the other hand, you don't want to get masochistic about it. You're not wearing a hair shirt and flagellating yourself. All right, Ray, do you want to guide me to the next question? Because I'm embarrassed. I'd love to have these questions, if you don't mind, Ray, giving them to me later, just for my own self-reflection, even if I'm not able to answer them. But in the time we have left, which is about 15 minutes, I think, isn't it? You can
How about one more question? How about one more question from the EU retreat?
Okay, great.
Okay.
So thank you so much, Dr. Lembke. You're welcome. Can you please tell me, according to your research and your patient history, what are the biggest differences between male and female sex and porn addicts? Well, one of the biggest differences is just simple prevalence. There are many, many more male sex addicts than female sex addicts. And I think this just comes down to simple biology, in terms of sex drive. And we just know that although even within a gender or within sexes, it's a bimodal distribution of sex drive, we do know that that distribution or that curve is shifted to the right for men compared to women. Men are biologically evolved over millions of years of evolution to be just more interested in sex and seeking out sex. But I think in terms of the phenomenology of women versus men, it's probably not that different, except that for women, I'm going to go out on a limb and say, I think that the whole fantasy around love and the relationship, and even some of the codependency patterns, may be more prominent for women than the actual sex itself. That sounds really sexist, but that's what I think.
Now, let me give you one more question here. This is from Antoine, the EU retreat. Although not approved for sex or porn addiction, I have heard that naltrexone is being used successfully for sex and porn addicts who suffer from severe withdrawals, even after a period of abstinence. What is your opinion?
Well, naltrexone, let me just, for the benefit of the group, it's an opioid receptor blocker. So the idea is that it was originally FDA approved for the treatment of alcohol use disorder, not opioid addiction, which is interesting. Why is that? Because alcohol is mediated primarily through our endogenous opioid system. We make our own opioids, endorphins and enkephalins. They're extremely short-lived, but we make them, and we make them in response to injury, like exercise, which is immediately toxic to cells, which is this whole science of hormesis. By doing things that are hard, we can upregulate our own production of things like endogenous opioids. So how would naltrexone help alcohol addiction? Because you're blocking the opioid receptor, you don't get the same bang for your buck, so it's not as reinforcing. And in that sense, you're retraining your brain. For opioid addiction, it works obviously by just blocking the opioid. The opioid doesn't work when you have naltrexone on board. Why might it work for sex addiction? So first of all, it's not FDA approved for sex addiction. And I myself am not familiar with any studies in its use for sex addiction, but I am aware of it being used off-label for many different addictions, from food addiction to gambling addiction to sex addiction. And the way that we think it works is that our drug of choice, let's say sex and alcohol, for example, it's not just dopamine. Dopamine is not the only neurotransmitter. These are complex molecules. The brain is a complex organism. And probably what happens with sex addiction, as with alcohol, is that it releases some of our own endogenous endorphins or opioids. Not even just when we're engaging in our use, but also when we're thinking about it. Remember, anticipating our drug makes us a little bit high. So if you have naltrexone on board, you're blocking that opioid receptor. That means if your body starts to make it as you anticipate your drug, you're blocking its effects. So you're not going to get that anticipatory high, which then leads to the anticipatory craving, which then motivates the work. So that's how it works for alcohol. And I suspect that's also how it's going to work for sex addiction. I have not used it for sex addiction myself in my clinical practice.
Here's another question that looks pretty good. Is there any data on the rate of sex addiction and recovery in the LGBT community?
There are data on this, and I'm not remembering the source, but I believe that sex addiction and mental health disorders broadly occur at higher rates, have higher prevalence in the LGBTQ+ community. And of course, we do know that men who have sex with men are especially vulnerable to sex addiction, both because of the culture around sex and also the way that sex is often combined with party and play drugs. So then you've got other drugs in the mix.
about this one? Can you take a moment to speak on the spiritual solution of the program in light of the physical and psychological truths you were sharing with us?
Yeah, so I do think that the spiritual aspect of the 12 steps is really key, and it's an interesting mystery, you know, on how that works. But basically, just like there's this reward circuit in the brain, there is probably also a spirituality circuit, and it's slowly being elucidated. And actually, I've been doing a lot of reading on that recently. And I think what's happened in the modern world as we've, you know, embraced this materialistic and materialism broadly, that the universe is composed of atoms that are bouncing around, that make up everything in the universe, governed not just by Newton's laws of physics, but also electricity and magnetism, and now special and general theory of relativity. Those are Einstein's theories, and things like quantum gravity. That's all very wonderful and exciting, but it very much leaves out the human element, and especially the emotional element. I've had physicists say to me, oh, no, it doesn't. You know, there's this majesty and wonder in the physical laws in the universe. And I'm like, well, that's great, but you spend all of your days in prayer as a physicist, because you're basically, you know, exercising the prayer of math and science around that. But the rest of us, we can barely understand that stuff. So that's not going to really work for us, or at least not in its current form. And I do think that in not exercising our spirituality circuit, we're denying a very important and real part of ourselves. And when we atrophy that part of ourselves, the part that lights up, you know, in compensation is the control part of ourselves, which is also the narcissistic, self-aggrandizing part of ourselves. Because of course, at the core of spirituality is surrender, right? We might not be surrendering to, you know, a supernatural power. We might just be surrendering to group consciousness. But at the core of it, what we're doing is we're saying, hey, I need to stop driving the bus. When I'm in control, things go wrong. I'm going to let something greater than myself, a higher power, kind of guide me. And I'm going to find different ways to tune into that higher power. When we do that, we are working our spirituality circuit. And when we're working our spirituality circuit, we're not working our narcissism and control circuit. And there's fascinating scientific literature showing that just like pleasure and pain are opposite sides of the balance, control and surrender are opponent process networks. We can't work them both at the same time. When we work one, we're not working the other. And I think what's happened in modern times is that we're relentlessly pursuing our control of the universe, our individual achievement, getting attention, getting love, and we're not in that process stimulating and using our spirituality circuit to our severe detriment. So we have to engage in spiritual exercises and take our narcissism and our control offline. And however you can find to do that, you know, is great, but you got to do it because it is at the core of recovery.
Amen.
Is there a difference between what's in a sex addict's arousal template and what's driven by addiction? How can a sex addict define healthy sexual behavior when their perception of intimacy has been skewed to the point of shame around what's in their arousal template?
Ray, can you show me where that is? Because you were kind of cutting in and out, and the language was important.
It's pretty far down near the bottom. How about now? Can you hear me now? Better?
Yeah.
No?
Yeah.
Okay. Is there a difference between what's in a sex addict's arousal template and what's driven by addiction? How can a sex addict define healthy sexual behavior when their perception of intimacy has been skewed to the point of shame around what's in their arousal template?
Yeah, so hard. I think the key to this is a period of abstinence so that you reset reward pathways. So you're not stimulating that circuit so that you can then go back to trying to find joy in sexual arousal, but link it meaning for yourself. And you can't do that until you've had a period of abstinence. And then you have to be obviously in healthy and adaptive relationships. And I remember one of my supervisors way back said to me that the most important thing that happens between a couple can be encompassed by a 4-letter word that ends with K. And the word is talk. The word is talk. So it's so hard to talk about sex, but if we've struggled with sex addiction, we need to do that even as part of the de-shaming process, to get it out in the open. And that's of course why these groups are so valuable, right? You hear other people talking about it and then you're, oh, I'm not alone. I also do that, or I've done that, right? I'm not some kind of freak. I don't have to be hiding this in the closet. This is basically just what's happened to me is my motivation and reward pathway has been co-opted by this one object. And I've gone down this road, pretty far, but I can come back from this and I'm not alone.
I think there's a related question. What about the single addicts that don't have a desire to date? Is it healthy to go long periods of time without sexual intimacy, since sex is a human need? Do these addicts need to change their views on dating?
Yeah, great. So I think part of what happens in recovery is the restructuring of our identity from what we thought we were, the person we thought we were, to the person that we really are. And I'm going to give you a little anecdote from my patients with alcohol use disorder, and then I'm going to link it to the question. So I have many patients who get into recovery from alcohol use disorder who say to me, I used to think that I loved parties and loved being around a lot of people. And now I realize in recovery that I'm actually a pretty shy person and I don't actually like parties. They're not fun, right? And of course they're fun if you're drinking, but they're not fun if you're not. So it's this restructuring of this person's identity as, oh, I'm not a party animal, right? Actually, I'm kind of a homebody. And the way that I can really regenerate and restore myself is spending time with 1 or 2 friends, doing something like a puzzle or whatever, watching a show. The way that relates here is that I think that it's possible that some people with sex addiction don't even really have a very high sex drive, or are not fundamentally even all that interested in sex, that sex really just became a maladaptive coping. And so it's possible, I think it's possible. So in other words, I've had people who get into recovery from sex addiction and then describe that they have very little libido. They have really quite little interest in sex. And I mean, it's complicated, but I think this is all part of like the rediscovery and redefining process. Like, who am I? And also I think, there's a spectrum of sexual desire, and there are people who are celibate their whole lives and they're asexual. They're not interested in sex. And like, that's okay, right? So you don't have to be a super sexual being to be a healthy, happy person. So I think maybe that wasn't all that satisfactory an answer, but I guess what I'm trying to say is that I think there's just in recovery a redefining process.
Okay, I think we have time for one last question, and this is from Jeff. Is there any ongoing research a sex addict could be a part of in order to help us to learn more?
Oh, that's so great. What a nice thing. And, I don't really do that kind of clinical research myself. And I'm sure there is research, but I have to look into it. I'll look into it, but it's very generous and altruistic of you. One of the things that I am very interested in is the spiritual piece. And so I am looking for people to kind of interview people who've had a kind of a spiritual awakening in recovery. So that is my research. So if you're of any interest in participating in that, feel free to reach out and let me know. And then as far as not getting to all of the questions, maybe what I can do is if you send me the questions, Ray, if I feel like there are some key ones that I didn't really answer, I think there's some homology and overlap in a bunch of the questions, but if there are some key ones that I didn't answer that I feel like I could answer, if I don't feel like I can answer it, I'm not going to try, but if I feel like I could, then I'm happy to try to respond and send back to you.
Right. Thank you, Anna. And everybody take yourself off mute so we can give Anna a nice round of applause.
Thank you.
Holy cow.
so much,
Anna.
Anna.
We really appreciate it.
So
So
much.
much.
You're great. You guys are my heroes.
Fantastic.
Thank
you,
Dr.
You
Lembke.
guys are my,
That was
you guys are
great.
my heroes. Really, you're my heroes. Recovery is worth it. Just keep taking it one day at a time and do it in your wonderful community. I love that you guys have built this community. It gives me an enormous amount of joy